Welcome to episode 164 of the Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Amy Bucher, author of Engaged, Designing for Behavior Change. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. Today, I'm very excited to have Dr. Amy Bucher on the show to talk about how you can design for behavior change using insights from her fantastic career and wonderful book, Engaged. Amy graduated magna cum laude from Harvard when getting her AB in psychology, so that's amazing. After which she went on to get her Ph.D. in organizational psychology from the University of Michigan. She's been a consultant in addition to working at Johnson & Johnson, CVS, and was vice president of behavior change design at Mad Pow before recently moving to her current role as vice president of behavioral design at Lirio. And don't worry, you're going to get to hear lots of interesting insights from Amy's work and more on her background as we get into the episode. But before we jump into that, a quick housekeeping note. There are lots of links to past episodes, books mentioned on the show, and how to get in touch with Amy within the show notes for the episode, which are waiting for you within the app you're listening to or at thebrainybusiness.com/164. Those already on the Brainy Business list got a direct link from me in the email you receive every Friday. Not on the list yet? Simply sign up for any freebie at thebrainybusiness.com and you'll be automatically added. The freebie for this episode is the first chapter of my award-winning book, What Your Customer Wants and Can't Tell You. And if you already have the book, in which case, thank you, you'll also be automatically added to the list when you get your copy of the free PDF companion workbook. Both are housed in our free behavioral economics community called the Be Thoughtful Revolution. There's a link to join that global community in those show notes as well. Now let's jump in. Dr. Amy Bucher, welcome to the Brainy Business Podcast.
Thank you so much. I've really been looking forward to talking to you.
Yay, me too. As we were saying in kind of our pre-interview discussion, I guess, that we've been connected on LinkedIn for a while. You've been somebody on my list for quite some time to reach out to. So I'm glad that we were able to find a time. But let's start with you telling everybody who's listening about you and your work and how you got into behavioral design.
Yeah, so I am currently at Lirio as Vice President of Behavioral Design. This is a new role for me. I think this is my 5th week. Prior to that, I was the Vice President of Behavior Change Design at Mad Pow, which is a consultancy. So I've moved from the consultant role back to an in-house role, which I feel like is kind of my roots. My first real behavioral design job was for a startup called Health Media that was associated with the University of Michigan. Professor Vic Strecker from the School of Public Health there had done a lot of research on tailoring and creating really tailored interventions to change health behavior and was able to spin it out into a company. So I joined that team, really learned a lot about digital and technology, and then we were acquired by Johnson & Johnson. And what was really cool about that is it let me dip my toes into the consulting world through an in-house role because I was working inside Johnson & Johnson, which is a huge, multinational company with about 250 sub-companies within it. And as a behavior scientist, I was able to go and work with all different brands, all different companies, really get the best of both worlds. So I sort of, product, consulting, product. So back home, it feels like. But even prior to all that, I have my Ph.D. in psychology. And I think like a lot of people in my generation of behavior scientists, I wasn't totally sure what to do with my qualifications. The path that was laid out in front of me was really, if you're getting a PhD, you're going to become an academic. You'll be a professor at a research university and do what your mentors have done. And I realized really early that that was not the path I wanted to take for a variety of reasons. Kind of stumbled into the job roles that I had, but I feel really fortunate because I love behavioral design. I really think it's a wonderful application of the skills that you learn in academic training. And now that I've been doing it for over 15 years, I'm seeing this rising generation of new behavioral designers that I am just so excited to have as part of my professional community. people that I can work with and, sometimes mentor, sometimes learn from. But it's just been this sort of wonderful evolution now that I look back over all of these choices in my career that didn't always feel as logical as they turned out to be.
Yeah, it's a common theme I found amongst people in the behavioral sciences of because it wasn't something that we were able to as children be like, someday I'm going to grow up and become a behavioral economist because it wasn't a thing that anybody knew and there weren't classes for or anything that you could have that be the plan. And so people that go through all these random routes to get here. I love just that combined brain space that we're able to have where we have people with engineering degrees like Katie Milkman, psychology, philosophy, and just all kind of coming together to be able to create a really cool field. So you mentioned, so you ended up working with, Johnson & Johnson through a couple things, but so was healthcare something that was really interesting to you, or, that's that type of like consumer product, something that you, when you went into industry and kind of started or in your Ph.D. program that you thought was something you were focused on, or it just sort of happened that way?
It just kind of happened that way. But again, looking back, I think the seeds for it were planted pretty early. It's funny. I think a lot of women, there was that SNL skit about, I sit down and I watch my murder show.
Yeah.
Similarly, I also have always enjoyed reading sort of murder mystery type things, real life forensics, like things that had that medical angle to them. And like, how do I solve this medical mystery? So that's long been a preferred type of reading material for me. I briefly, very briefly considered becoming a physician, but the pre-medical requirements, I kind of looked at them and like, oh no, I'm not doing that. And sometimes I regret that because I think I would have been a good doctor. My stomach doesn't turn when I see blood. I can kind of get in there and appreciate a situation for the problem it is and help to solve it. My first job out of grad school, which was really not a behavioral design job, was in healthcare. That was by accident. I bought a new computer and I was transferring files and looking back, and I had all of my cover letters from my first foray into the job market. And there were like 50 or 60 of them. And I looked back and I just, oh, girl, you were trying so hard. Some of the things I said in those letters, I'm glad that nobody took that seriously. But ended up in a healthcare focused agency. I was doing research for them. So I was, running focus groups and doing surveys and doing sort of market scans, that kind of thing. Really didn't like the job that much. It wasn't exercising my psychology background the way I wanted it to, but I realized in that job that I really liked working in the healthcare space, that there were a lot of challenges to work on that were relevant to behavior science. I just find it interesting, honestly, is part of it. So I guess getting back to that whole murder mystery thing, like there's an element of it that I just find appealing on kind of an intellectual level. And then I was lucky to find Health Media as my next job, the company that J&J acquired, because that was a healthcare, its name is Health Media. You can probably guess it was a health focused company.
Right.
But that's where I really started to dive deep into healthcare as a behavioral focus.
Awesome. And so if you were to let's just talk a little bit about the, behavioral design. I know for some people, if it's maybe a term that you're not as familiar with, knowing it's kind of a newer space, there are probably a lot of people that aren't as familiar with it. When you talk about design, I know people then probably say, well, is this just like design thinking? Is it graphic design? What's the crossover? Like, how do you explain behavioral design? And I guess that sort of work that you do and why it's important.
Yeah, so it depends on the audience how I describe it. I have a lot of different metaphors and euphemisms that I use that I find work depending on who I'm talking to. I think at its essence, it's really applying the scientific method to the process of design. And I consider it to be extremely compatible with human-centered design, because human-centered design is really about understanding the experience of the person at the center of whatever it is you're designing for. And similarly, behavioral design really requires us to understand the experience of the person whose behavior we're hoping to influence. So a lot of the methods and tools are really compatible with each other. The behavioral design process is very front-loaded. So there's a lot of, actually, I've been saying this a lot recently. It's really very much a measure twice, cut once type of discipline. We want to really do a lot of research up front to understand the problem space, to understand the work that's been done before so that we can build on it, not repeat mistakes of the past. And, then from there, begin to testing those solutions, implementing them and putting them out in the world. And I think I've already mentioned measuring and testing a couple times, but really that measurement is a constant in the behavioral design process. We really want to be at every step of the way, gathering data that lets us know if we're on the right track or not, so that we can adjust and optimize our results. And of course, in the end, know what our results are.
Yes. I have an episode about the importance of understanding the problem, and the biggest mistake everybody makes is not spending enough time up front. And so I always get very excited whenever anybody says the same thing, that yes, whether you're looking specifically at behavioral science or behavioral economics or just any project, everyone please spend more time thinking about the problem you're trying to solve.
Absolutely. Yes. Cosign.
Yeah. Amy and Melina say, yes, do this. That's good. Do you have an example? This could be a favorite case study from Mad Pow or anywhere else, knowing that, like you said, at this point, you've been at Lirio for all of 5 weeks, so probably don't have much from there yet, but, something. So if somebody was going to be working on a project, what's the inspiring one, something cool that you enjoyed?
So one of my favorite projects I ever worked on was at J&J. And as I mentioned, Johnson & Johnson's organized as a number of smaller companies under the parent umbrella, and they're semi-autonomous. So this was a pretty typical J&J project in which there were, I think, 3 different operating companies working together, almost like, it was almost like we had a lead company who'd hired others as vendors. But the wellness and prevention was what they named our part of the company after they acquired us. So the behavior science, the digital health coaching folks, we were one of the teams, and it was LifeScan, which was a J&J company at the time. They do diabetes care. So test strips and meters, things that you would use to test your blood sugar. And then Johnson & Johnson Medical India is actually a group that they have in India that handles a lot of their operations there. And so the project was to look at tier 2 cities in India where there is an increasing incidence of type 2 diabetes, and try to figure out how we could intervene behaviorally in order to help people manage those, their diabetes. And specifically, the problem that they had observed is that people in India were not testing their blood sugar at clinically recommended levels. So clinically speaking, if you are testing your blood sugar and you have diabetes, it's roughly 5 times a day. And of course, that varies on the patient, but just as an average, 5 times a day. And the data for India showed that it was probably 2 times a week for most patients. So real big delta there. And what I loved about the project, so first of all, on a personal, selfish note, I love to travel. I love to experience new cultures. This was an incredible opportunity, not just to go to India, but to go to India and really see, I spent time in clinics and doctors' offices and hospitals, really seeing behind the scenes how life is lived in a different context from the one that I belong to. So that was just amazing, both as a person and a behavior scientist to get to experience that. But what was also really rewarding about it was developing this very intricate intervention that didn't look the way we expected, because we did all of that research on the ground and really tried to understand the problem in context. So one of the things that we learned, I mentioned our product was called digital health coaching. It was online. It was primarily something you'd access through a browser. And when we were doing our research, one of the things that became clear is that we couldn't just rely on data about internet access on kind of a city level. The patients we were seeing in the clinics that we were targeting to receive our intervention mostly did not have internet access. They would not be able to use a digital coaching solution. And so we pivoted in terms of our modality, and we actually built something that the clinician would interface with during a visit. So, instead of taking notes in an EMR, they could actually input some information into the system. It would tailor and personalize a coaching plan for the patient based on that conversation. There'd be a printout that the clinician could provide, but the patient never had to go online. And then as they were tracking their data and updating the system, they could do it through a simple SMS text message, because people do have cell phones. This, by the way, was 2010. So some of what I'm saying may no longer be accurate, but at the time, to me, it was kind of a revelation to see not only that upfront research influences the content of the intervention, but sometimes the modality of it, that we really had to go back to basics in some ways and rethink how we were offering the solution at all. So I learned a lot from it. I had a lot of fun doing it. It was extremely rewarding.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, just like you're saying, may feel like, well, we just need a better system. Like we need it to, in the way of we need to make sure that they know up front that they should be doing it 5 times a day. And if they only knew this, right? If logically, the logic part of the brain, right? If they only knew the consequences of not tracking as much, then they would change their behavior. That's what's needed. And if you actually take a step back and say, well, actually, they can't upload it, right? So what's the point? They don't have the means to make that happen, no matter how much they want to, until we change our process.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing that was really interesting about that, I think as a behavioral designer, it's really critical that I have respect for the people that I'm designing for. And that's a place, again, where there's overlap with human-centered design, because that whole discipline comes with a strong sense of empathy and respect for the people who are the recipients of your design. The barriers that people had to testing were very real, because just like you said, my logical brain was, okay, the science says this is a good thing. Like, why aren't people doing it? And the strips are cheap. They're 10 cents each. Well, they're 10 cents each in the US, and they're also 10 cents each in India, where income levels are very different. So the price was a real barrier that honestly, we didn't do anything to address in that project. And I've spoken recently about this a little bit as I look back, like now with my level of seniority, and I feel a little bit more empowered to speak up about things sometimes. I feel like if I were doing this project today, I would push as hard as I could on what can we do in terms of cost relief. At the time, I didn't do that. I don't know that it even occurred to me. We also saw there were cultural beliefs around insulin use that were influencing how people manage their diabetes. And those cultural beliefs weren't ones that resonated with me as someone who grew up in the United States, but they were very real and they were quite common. And, I had to be respectful of the fact that people had a certain perception toward this medical care that I wasn't going to break through or change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just really interesting to think, again, like you said, some of it, we're talking got some hindsight 2020, hindsight bias coming in, even like when you're talking about your cover letters from earlier, like where you look back and go, oh, why didn't I, or I should have thought about this. But I'm sure that shapes other projects you work on now. Like you said, things where you will or have kind of stood up and said, yes, this all matters. And what about these other things, and bringing that to the table?
Yeah, absolutely. I have worked with a number of health plan clients over the years, and I did one project recently with a health plan client looking at behavioral health and behavioral health care. And one of the primary barriers to people utilizing that type of care is the cost of it, and finding care that is covered by insurance, because a lot of providers actually don't accept insurance. They don't get reimbursed at the same kind of rate with insurance as they do through cash pay. And so with my client, I was very direct that, the cost is a barrier. The more you can find ways to offer people lower cost options, or to reduce, or reimburse the providers at a higher rate that is closer to what they get in the cash market. That's definitely something that's inspired by my earlier experience. I don't know that I would have been so bold to bring that up, because it is uncomfortable. We're not comfortable in general, I think, talking about money with our clients when we're talking about behavior. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I think too, just even not to say that herding is but herding is one of those things that no matter how much we don't want it to impact us, it does. And we'd rather be conventionally wrong than unconventionally right. And it can be hard to, especially when everyone in the room, you assume they must have thought about it. They've been here longer than me. It's their product. They probably talked about it. So I just won't bring it up. Something like that.
Yeah. And especially, it's not that they weren't aware that cost was an issue, that they are not ostriches with their head in the sand. And I know that the people on our client team are not necessarily the people who are able to influence the cost or the way that money flows through the system. But the more that we can give them leverage to take back to the people who are the ones who make those decisions, I think that's part of our responsibility. Just even if we know we're not going to make the change with speaking up in this one moment, speaking up in the one moment is like a grain of sand that ultimately, I hope, will add up to something more meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I also just wanted to touch on where you were talking about, understanding the real problem, taking a look, as we've been talking about already. I wrote an article, and I believe it was the 2019 Nobel prizes that one went to a team that had been increasing attendance in school and grades and things. That they were looking in Africa and rural parts of India and trying to help the students to perform. and be able to, get good grades and go to school and all of that. And with looking at the problem, the first kind of surface level is saying, well, they don't have textbooks. Like they don't have good textbooks or access to textbooks. That's got to be the problem. And I think anybody looking at that pretty easily would say, well, yeah, like A to B, easy connection point. Let's start our nonprofit and we'll get all these textbooks sent. Yay, us. We did it, right? We raised all the money and sent the textbooks. Thankfully, with this team doing some research and seeing what was really going on, was that the teachers weren't going. There wasn't the motivation for them to go in. So addressing that incentive, even where they, tested against some places where they sent books, it didn't matter when there was nobody to teach the kids. And so finding that right problem, whatever that happens to be, is just, again, so critically important. Even when it seems so obvious what the issue is, just hit pause, make sure it really is. And it might be part of it, or it could be the whole thing, but it's better to be sure. Like you said, measure twice.
Yep. What you just said reminds me, actually, my father-in-law gives very practical gifts all the time. And one year he gave me this pink solar powered flashlight, and he'd bought it from a nonprofit. I forget what part of the world they work in, but it's, rural. They don't have electricity. And similar to what you just said, they were having issues with girls in particular, not succeeding in school. And they thought the issue might be that they didn't have lights that they could use to read do their homework once night fell. And so they were distributing these flashlights, and it didn't solve the problem. And it turned out the reason why is the boys were basically stealing all the girls' flashlights. So they made the flashlights pink, and there was a stigma against boys stealing the pink flashlights. So my father-in-law found out about this, and they were running a thing where if you bought one flashlight, they would donate one to this place. So I have this pink solar powered flashlight, and I always think of that as an interesting example of, you kind of knew what the problem was, but that extra research really got you to an accurate place.
Yeah. That's awesome. I love all those sorts of stories. It also makes me think of one, which I don't remember where I heard it, or I'm sure I read in a book, but again, I can't place where it came from, but it was talking about, where malaria obviously being an issue, and mosquito nets, simple solve in a lot of places. But even when they were essentially giving them away, people weren't hanging them in their houses because they didn't like how they looked. It was an aesthetics piece. And you would think, well, it's got to just be functionality. That's all that matters. Who cares? But the humans in us still want things that look nice.
Yeah. Yes, we do.
All right. So just looking at, so your book, Engaged, Designing for Behavior Change, for people that are listening and they are wanting to kind of start this process. If we assume it's someone, maybe they're in marketing or anywhere else in an organization, what's kind of the first piece of advice, other than understanding the problem, that you would be giving to people? Or if you have, a specific framework you want to share, kind of what's the best way to go about designing for behavior change?
Yeah. Wow. So as you were asking the question, I had about 6 different things flash into my head, and I can't have 6 first things.
Well,
Yeah, no, I have been trying to compile a list of resources for people to read that are accessible to a non-academic audience, as kind of like, here's your 101 reading list to start to understand behavioral design as a process, but also some of the frameworks and tools that you might use. So that's something I do need to update it. I haven't touched it in a while. Like I will add your book to that, because I think that's a wonderful overview of behavioral economics that I haven't seen anything quite like, but similar sorts of books that are extremely accessible. So that's the first thing, I guess, that I recommend to people. As a general process, I mean, it's really going through discovery to design to testing, and trying to make sure that people think about those as distinct phases. When I was at Mad Pow, I really liked the way we talked about it. So I'll say it now, even though I'm not part of that organization anymore. I mean, we'd had diagnose, prescribe. I think it was develop. I'm already forgetting the third one. And evaluate. But just breaking down that process in a systematic way. And I always think of it as aligning with the scientific method. You create your hypotheses and you test them, and then you revise based on what you learn. And then the other thing I tell people is if they've gotten to the stage where they feel like they have a sense of what behavioral design is and they want to actually test it out, what are some tools that are accessible to someone who's new to it? And there are 3 that I tend to recommend. So one is trying to do a literature review. And I always feel like that is a bit of a boring recommendation, like, go do a book report on the published research. But it's such a critical step in behavioral design to understand the science that has come before, the methods that have worked and the methods that maybe didn't work as well as we want them to. And I think it saves a lot of pain if you can build on the success of other proven interventions. So, and it's a great exercise in understanding what behavioral design has looked like for other researchers, other practitioners, and in other contexts. So lit review is one. The second is creating a simple outcomes logic map for yourself. So really identifying the outcomes you hope to achieve with your project, the behaviors that you're trying to influence in order to get to those outcomes. And then what are the barriers that exist to people performing those behaviors? What are the things that you need to put into your intervention, your offering, in order to overcome those barriers, get the behaviors to happen and get to your successful results? Just laying those out in a systematic and logical way, I think really helps put people into that behavioral design mindset and get them to approach their project activities in a more, appropriate way for that skill set. And then the third is doing a lensed brainstorm, because there are these really fun points in many of our design projects, or if you're a marketer, like maybe you're creating a new campaign and you're in this sort of creative, generative phase of the project. And this is an opportunity to use behavioral lenses as you generate those ideas. So this is where some of the specific frameworks might come in. One that I use a lot and I talk about in my book is the COM-B model, part of the behavior change wheel. COM-B is an acronym. So the B is behavior, and then it's capability, opportunity, motivation. If you're doing a lensed brainstorm, you could say, okay, we're going to try to change our customers' behavior. We want them to click purchase on this website. How can we enhance their capability to do that? How can we enhance the opportunity for them to do that? How can we enhance the motivation for them to do that? And really separate out your ideas in those buckets. It helps get that better aligned with the proven theory of how you might get people to take action. Another one that I use a lot in those sorts of things is the self-determination theory of motivation. And I won't go too into that, but one of the basic ideas is that if you want to get somebody really intrinsically interested in something, like really interested to the point where they're likely to pursue it, you should support their feelings of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And so again, using those three things as the brainstorming lenses, can we think of ways that we can get our ideas to align with that?
Ooh. So kind of like where you said, I asked the question, you had 6 things. And now for each one, I was like, but no, this one. So you provided so many valuable pieces there. Of course, we'll link to the book as far as what should people do to find out what these are, read the book, there'll be a link. So we've got that. But do you have an example of where you could share, and maybe it's something that you kind of make up as we go, of an amalgamation of processes of how this might work. But assuming, if a client was to come to you and they have a problem, like what might that problem be in the way that it's stated to you? And how would you kind of walk through from, getting from A to Z using some of what you were just talking about to make that a little bit more practical for somebody?
Yeah, actually, I can use that example that I just mentioned of the project that I did for a health plan around behavioral health. So that's a recent-ish real example. It was less than a year ago. So health plan, the team that hired us was totally focused on wellness and had been given responsibility for behavioral health, especially in terms of their digital tools. So there's kind of the whole healthcare side of the business, but then they have these additional tools that are, I guess, more consumer facing. Like if you're a health plan member, you get access to these additional resources. So the team we were working with owned those things. And they wanted us to help them understand what people needed for behavioral health. And some of the questions they came to us with were, we have a wellness offering. Does it make sense to make behavioral health, mental health part of that? Or does it need to be a standalone? Like how different is it? And where does the line fall? What kind of tools will people find valuable? How can we offer them something digitally that enhances their experience working with a provider, a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a counselor? So kind of a loose amalgam of questions, but we knew that the end result they wanted to get to was, what can we give this team where they can go out and build either a new offering or something into their existing offering so that they are providing behavioral health support to their members? So it was kind of a big question. We often in behavioral design do work with ambiguous questions. So one of the things that I advise people is be comfortable with the gray area. You will go through a lot of the process not really knowing yet, but the process works. So what we did, we do a light literature review. So just in general, what are some of the issues that are in the field of behavioral health? And unfortunately, this is a little bit broad because behavioral health covers everything from feeling like stressed out and not sleeping well to having more severe clinical issues. So it was a little bit broad, but we wanted to understand with the literature review. We spent quite some time with our clients. So we do stakeholder interviews where we talk to folks in the organization who have knowledge and expertise around the problem area. And we're trying to understand it from different angles because whatever solution we put out there, it will probably hit multiple teams at the client organization. If we put a new app out, there may be people who call the customer support number with questions about it. There may be people who go to their doctor and say, hey, I'm using this app. What do you know about it? So we're trying to understand where those touch points might lie so that we can anticipate them in our design, as well as get partnership with the people who will need to support it. We don't want someone calling the call center 6 months from now, complaining about an app we helped build, and the call center person's like, I've never heard of this, and I don't think you should use it. We want them excited about it too. We want them to feel like they had a voice in building it. So we're trying to build a coalition as well as learn so that we design appropriately. And then primary research is a really big part of it. So for that project, we interviewed, I want to say 30 patients and caregivers who really fell across that range of behavioral health concerns, as well as a number of providers who had all different specialties and focus areas. And when we're doing these interviews, they're very pointed towards specific questions that we've generated with the clients, really around how can we get people to utilize mental health care services? What are some of the tools and supports that a health plan could offer you that you would find of value that would make your outcomes better? So of course, we want to have that change in clinical symptoms and have people feel better, have them function better, but also for our client, they want to build loyalty. They want people to like them as a brand. And so we're also thinking like what reflects well, what fits with their image, what builds their credibility in your eyes. So we go through all of that research. I mentioned, behavioral design, very heavy up front. This was the bulk of the work, I would say, and it really happens up front. And then from there, we start to go into identifying insights. What are some of the themes? What are the things that we learned from this research? And then based on what we've learned, what are the solutions? This is where models like that COM-B model I mentioned can come in really handy because in our insights, we can start to tag things as being capability, opportunity, motivation. And the model also includes almost a decision tree that says, if you observe issues in this area, these are the types of solutions that are likely to be effective. So we can start to narrow down what our solution set might look like. And again, that's calling back to the literature so that we're building on existing proof points. And then from there, it starts to resemble, I think, more of a typical design project for people who are familiar with those, where we might prototype things and put them in front of people and get their responses to it. Do you like this? Would you use it? Do you know how to use it? Is it meeting the client needs? But actually building the thing. And as a behavioral designer at this point, my role really becomes someone who's making sure that all of the ingredients that we talked about, all of the intervention ingredients, are being brought to life with fidelity. So, if we're talking about adding some loss aversion here, is that content really reflecting loss aversion? Does that functionality work in a way that brings this, behavioral element to life? And then ultimately we are launching whatever the thing is we designed. Sometimes it ends at a strategy report and it's on the clients to go and make choices about how they want to implement it. Sometimes we actually build the intervention and put it out in the world. If it's that latter case, we want to measure whether or not it works. So we'll have a plan in place to collect data and to evaluate the quality of the intervention.
Yeah. So you mentioned with the, with the COM-B that you would have, some standard ideas or that you got from the lit review of if we see something like this, this is what we would maybe be looking at intervention wise. Is there a set kind of you have in mind that like in general, these types of questions lead to priming or loss aversion as a tactic? And then the literature review is just sort of ends up confirming that, or does that change with each project really based on the literature review? And I'm guessing you're going to say it's a mix of both, but
it is a mix of both.
Yeah.
There's certain types of behaviors that are compatible with certain types of interventions. So, you mentioned loss aversion. Whenever I'm in a project where I know I'm asking people to make choices, that says to me that loss aversion might be in the toolkit. So I've done work with benefits administrators, like when you join a new job and you have to pick your health plan. I've just gone through this. You go to that website and you have to pick which health plan you're going to choose. I've done work on those websites where the administrator has an opinion about which plans people should choose. And I will say I'm as cynical about some of the insurance stuff as anybody, but typically they want to push people towards the plans that are more affordable for them. So it's high deductible health plans, but they look more expensive. Actually, you should, I feel like you would be the perfect person to solve some of the language around high deductible health plans. They're so confusing.
Right.
They scare people, but ultimately for most people, they are a more economical choice. And so I've done a couple projects where it's like, how do we create this web page so that when someone comes through, they understand that this is the better choice for them? Because the way the plans are described, it doesn't sound that way. It does exactly the opposite of what they would hope to do. So whenever I see that, I'm like, okay, I have an idea what might be in the toolkit. I think where the surprise comes in is back at what we were talking about before, where sometimes what we think is the problem doesn't turn out to be the problem when we do the research. So, I did one project recently that I probably can't get into a lot of details around, but our client said, our employees, there's this list of 5 or 6 behaviors that they're not doing that we really need them to do. We have data that if they do these behaviors, they will have better results. So we said, okay, we'll do the research. We'll understand why they're not doing the behaviors. We'll figure out, how we address that. And when we did the research, we discovered out of the list of behaviors they gave us, there was one that we're like, this is actually probably not really a great behavior. Like people hate it and it doesn't actually seem to be driving the results that you're after. And there was another one that the client thought people weren't doing, but it turns out they were. So we had to pivot the problem a little bit, and we did uncover some nuances on the other behaviors as well. It was really interesting. Like one of the things they wanted people to be recording details of their interactions with customers in the customer relationship management system, the CRM. So in Salesforce or whatever it was they were using. And they were complaining that people didn't do that. And it turned out that they were capturing their data by hand oftentimes. So it was a slightly different problem. It wasn't that they weren't capturing the data. They weren't capturing it in the right place.
Right.
So not a surprise in terms of the interventions we needed, more like this isn't the project we thought it was.
Yeah. Well, that's even, so as I had mentioned when we were getting started here is I take handwritten notes, and you saw it before. Look at all these notes on here now, blank sheet of paper, but now it's full of stuff. Whenever I'm doing interviews, I always have to write them by hand. For one, because we're recording a podcast, and I'm sure, for people that are on the phone with people to hear click, 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 click while you're typing would be terrible. And it's not really great. But then I have to go back and put that in when I'm creating the show notes. Technically, it's maybe a little bit longer. And the only reason I get stuff out of the notebook is because I actually need them for the episode to go live. But if you're thinking those notes are just for you, we're making it easy for people to get over that one barrier of just placing it into where they need it.
Yeah. And let me add another really interesting thing we found is that for some of the people we talked to, they didn't like entering it into the system because that felt really impersonal. They felt, really warm and fuzzy toward their clients. And like, this is a real personal relationship. And now I'm going to put into the CMS, or is that right? Yeah.
CRM.
Thank you. I'm in acronym land. CRM. I'm going to put into the CRM that like this person has a grandson named George. Like that feels cold. That feels impersonal. Mm-hmm. So that was, one of the things that we recommended is if they have the ability to do the, handwriting to text scan, like have people write it on their tablet and see if maybe that's a way to overcome the problem, because then it still feels like you're making the personal note, but it's getting into the right database.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's all they have the notebooks these days where it's transferring over. So I keep thinking I'm going to get one of those. Time discounting hasn't worked out so much in my favor yet, but someday I'll get one of those. Yeah. Well, I think I love all of what you've talked about there. Thank you for walking through, kind of what this might look like or has looked like on projects, knowing, of course, every project is different, which is, why having a resource like a book or something to, the options you want to go through is so important. I am curious. So you talked about, you said a simple outcome logics map. Is that something that there's a standard type of format for one that you really like, or that where people are going to, if they wanted to go look that up and start that process, where do they start for that?
Yeah, so I have an example in my book, and I actually evolved it from something that one of my colleagues at Johnson and Johnson used to do. So I'll credit Dr. Steve Schwartz. He actually was one of the technical reviewers for the book as well. So someone who's been really influential in the way I approach this work. So there's an example in the book where I did sort of a basic blank one, and then I build it out. And those figures are actually available on my publisher's website for anybody. They have a Creative Commons license. So if you go to rosenfeldmedia.com and you look for Engaged, on the book page, there's a place where you can see all the images in the book. So that's a great place to see an example, very high level of what an outcomes logic map might look like. I don't think there is a standard version of it. I think that the concept is really common among behavior scientists, but I haven't seen like the version of what it might look like. The version in my book is where I usually start.
Cool. Well, I was thinking through, so I don't know if you've ever heard of Stormboard as a online resource. It's software, but like online, that it's virtual Post-it notes, and you can have multiple people on a team and you can change the colors of them and move them and turn them into index cards. I love using that as a Post-it person, but not being worried they're all going to fall off. I'll come in one day and it was someone opened a door and they all fell, and you go, no, like, where do they belong? But they have, the standard customer empathy map, and they actually have the hooked model from our friend Mural in there. And, some of these other human-centered design type stuff, they have Kanban and like all those are all in there. So I was, just curious if there was the like, oh yeah, it's very much like this versus something else, but there's a great place for people to go now. They have that great resource.
Yeah. And actually, I've used a lot of similar sound, or at least I think they're similar based on your description, but Mural also has some templates, if you're a Mural user, that would lend themselves to this. They don't have a, behavioral logic map template, but there's stuff in there you can work with for sure. And it is really good if you're collaborating. I will say, with the pandemic and switching to working from home, one of the things I missed the most was the rooms that we had with the dry erase walls and putting up the Post-its. Like, I really have grown fond of thinking in 3D space.
Yeah, absolutely. Our last house, my husband had painted one of the walls in my office was a whiteboard wall. So I was able to do that. It was still mostly just me in there, but it was great. I still was able to use it.
I think some of it is the visual reminder of what your brain is doing is really helpful.
Yeah. Priming. It's there. It matters for sure. Keep us on track. All that good stuff.
By the way, I wanted to say you cited my undergrad advisor in your book talking about priming. Priming was the thing that first got me interested in behavior science. So as an undergrad, I was in Nalini Ambadi's lab at Harvard University. And so she did some of that early work on stereotype boosts, like the Asian American women and stereotypes. Margaret Shee, who was her grad student and then went on to University of Michigan, I basically followed her there for my PhD because I wanted to continue working on this. Wow. And I was just, every time I see that research cited, I get so excited. Like it was such a formative thing for me. And I think really what captured my imagination was this idea that such small things can produce such big changes in the way that we perform.
Yeah. Ooh, well, that's so exciting. That's fun. I'm sure it's one of those where anytime if I read a book or listen on a podcast and so someone starts to say something and you go, oh, I think I know what that is. Like, I know that person. It's very exciting. So thank you. I reference that research often. And so, formative and important for me as well. Definitely not as significant as you, but that's amazing. I'm so glad to hear it. So thank you for letting me know. So as we go ahead and wrap up here, for everyone who is now just so excited, I know you mentioned, your publisher's website, but for people that want to get in contact with you, what's the best next step for them?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So I do have a website. I have been really poor about maintaining it between writing the book and, getting into a new job and just being really busy. But I have aspirations to get back to blogging on there. But anyway, it's Amy Bucher, Ph.D.com. Or I think I also have a redirect from Amy B, Ph.D., which is my Twitter name. So Twitter is also a place you can find me. But on my website, I try to archive links to things I've written, talks I've given, podcasts that I've been a guest on, things like that. So it's a good place to find, my work product if you want to do that. Rosenfeld Media is a great place. They have a lot of information and resources around my book. And I guess now I'm at Lirio. So you'll see some thought leadership type activities for me on lirio.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. And we will have all the links as we talked about. They're available so people can get in contact with you. And just thank you again for coming in and having just such a lovely conversation. It was really fun to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again to Dr. Amy Bucher for joining me on the show today. What got your brain buzzing in today's conversation? If you're anything like me, I'm guessing the various methods and frameworks Amy talked about are at the top of your list. Hearing someone talk about their approach to solving a problem is always fascinating to me, and I love that Amy has a few frameworks to turn to, depending on the problem at hand or at what step she's in the process. While there are many approaches to applying behavioral economics into business, I've definitely found some themes in speaking to many people about their approaches over the years. For example, in Amy's approach of going from discovery to design to testing, she starts with a literature review, which is so important and a very common thing amongst those of us who are trained within the field. You want to know what is out there and has already been done before you jump in on any project to help ensure you're solving the right problem and that you look at the best way to go about solving that problem. And it should not only be within your specific field or industry. Look for inspiration from all over when you do your literature review. There could be a method from anthropology or philosophy, or if you sell products from a service-based industry case study or vice versa. Go in with that open, inquisitive mind to see what you find and how it might apply. Being a curious questioner is so important to solving the big problems. And whatever you do, don't skip over this step. Give it considerably more time than you think it needs and see what amazing ideas you can find. Of course, whenever you find something interesting and come up with a cool idea from it, please do share it with me on social media. Find me, Melina Palmer, on LinkedIn, and you can include Dr. Amy Bucher as well. I'm sure she would love to hear what this episode has inspired for you. I've linked to ways for you to connect with Amy, her book Engaged, which goes way deeper into all those great frameworks she mentioned during the interview, as well as our Twitter handles and so many other great episodes and things like that within the show notes for you, which as a reminder are waiting for you at thebrainybusiness.com/164. Do note that we talked about hindsight bias quite a bit today, which doesn't have its own episode yet, but is the topic of the next solo episode, number 167. The team's going to go back and link it retroactively in the show notes when the episode has come out if you're listening to this later. And if you're particularly interested in hindsight bias and it isn't out yet, you can make a note to tune in when that comes out on August 27th. And do follow me on social media as we've started doing those sorts of teasers of upcoming episodes so you can know what's coming before anyone else. Also, Amy was very kind to say that she thinks I might be the perfect person to help tackle the problem of properly framing and helping people to make the best choice when looking at insurance plans. To which I want to say sounds like a fascinating project. So if anyone out there is looking to work on such a project, maybe you're in HR or something else, and are looking to incorporate behavioral economics into that process, send me an email so we can start a conversation and see if it makes sense to work together. Or even if you're working on something peripherally related that made you think, hey, that would be great for this other project I'm working on. Definitely, whoever you are, wherever you are, reach out to me at melina@thebrainybusiness.com, or there's a form at thebrainybusiness.com to send me some information about your project and see if it would be a fit for us to work together. I look forward to hearing from you. And as we close out the show, I want to share something very exciting. The Brainy Business was nominated for the Best Market Research Podcast of 2021, and voting is on now to determine the winner. This award is in partnership between Little Bird Marketing and Green Book, and there's a link for you to vote in the show notes. Voting is open until August 31st, 2021, and the winners will be announced in October. It takes all of 10 seconds to cast your vote. You just select the Brainy Business from the drop-down of nominees, enter your first name and email address, and click submit. Easy peasy. Will you show the Brainy Business a little love by taking 10 seconds to vote for the show to be Market Research Podcast of the Year? And if you're an overachiever, maybe taking an extra step to encourage 2 of your friends to vote as well? Thank you in advance for taking the time. And no matter what, thank you for listening to the Brainy Business. I appreciate you. And thank you again to Dr. Amy Bucher for joining me on the show today. It was a delight to chat with and learn from you. Next week on episode 165, Matej Suha of MindWorks and Inside BE is joining me for a very interesting conversation about bringing applied behavioral economics to the masses. It's going to be a lot of fun. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Molina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.